Hey folks, welcome to the show. This is the Other People podcast. I am Brad Listi. I'm your host. I'm in Los Angeles. It's nice to be with you. Thanks for listening. It is Friday, so that means it's time for a flashback episode where I dig into the Other People archives and share an outtake from a golden oldie. Today I'm going to be sharing an outtake from episode 679. My conversation with author Sebastian Castillo. Episode 679 first aired on November 4th, 2020. Sebastian Castillo is a writer and a teacher based in Philadelphia. He was born in Caracas, Venezuela, and grew up in New York. He is the author of a novella entitled Salmon. It is available from Shabby Doll House. His other books include 49 Venezuelan Novels, which is a collection of surreal microfiction. That one is available from Bottlecap Press. And he is also the author of another book entitled Not I, which was published by Word West in 2020. An outtake from episode 679, a flashback to my conversation with Sebastian Castillo, is coming up momentarily. So a quick reminder that I do a weekly email newsletter. You can subscribe for free over at bradlisti.substack.com. It's a great way to keep up with the show and keep up with what I'm reading. Likewise, there is an Other People Patreon community. You can join it at patreon.com/otherpplpod. Help keep this show going into the future. All right, so today's flashback once again comes from episode 679. It first aired on November 4th, 2020. A reminder that if you like what you hear in this flashback and you want to go in for the full conversation, you can do that. Episode 679 is in the feed, as are all episodes of this show. So have at it. All right, let's get going then with today's flashback. Here I am back in 2020 talking with Sebastian Castillo.
I think it was like it consciously came out of, teaching so much composition, but looking back on it, it must have motivated it somehow, looking at the sort of essential stuff of language every day and correcting these sort of small things. But yeah, in terms of the limitations too, it's like, I remember when I first started, I kind of wanted a distraction. I was working on short stories and I was just kind of getting tired of it. And I wanted something with like really rigid rules. And in some ways that actually became way more fun to write.
Sometimes I feel like I think constraints in general are good for art.
Yeah, I'm really influenced by the Oulipo writers. I never know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. They're mostly French. And I think Oulipo is an acronym for... I don't remember exactly what, but it's basically, all procedural, all constraint-based writing. I would say George Perec is probably the most famous of the group. He, he wrote a whole novel without the letter E, like some really wild stuff like that. It really spoke to me.
Damn, I'm trying to think of even like what you would. That must be the most tedious kind of writing ever. Trying to avoid the letter E.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting too is that it's the most common letter in French, and he originally wrote it in the French, and then it's also I think the most common letter in English, and so his translator pretty much had as much of a task at hand when he translated the book because he also had to avoid the letter E.
All right, that's you better get paid extra for that.
I know, right?
So I was thinking of Edouard Leve too, just the declarative, autobiographical, personal, though I feel like your book is a little bit more elliptical in some ways than his. Yours is a little bit more poetic. Like his feels like confessional. Am I on the right track?
I totally agree. I remember when I first read that book, Autoportrait, years ago. It was like totally blew me away. And I really loved how as you said, it's kind of these declarative sentences, and you would think that, I mean, they're kind of neutral in quality, right, emotionally, but it has a bit of like a cumulative effect where, halfway through you're like, why is this book so depressing? But yeah, in terms of difference, I would definitely say that it seems like his has a much more of a confessional bent, and I, in some ways, I guess, was trying to like write against that. I mean, there are things that are reflective of things that I believe or ways that I behave, but there are a lot of things that aren't, I guess, that are closer to lies than not. So there is definitely, an anti-confessionalism at play there.
Well, and I also think that there is, I'm trying to think of how to describe it, but I feel like the lines in your book, the reader can fit inside of them, whereas with Leve, it's very much him. And it's his life and his experience. And your books, the way that it's composed, I feel like, I don't know, I could feel like a level of access to each line that was personal to me. Yeah,
definitely. There were well, one of the things that I was thinking about when I was writing it was I wanted there to be a mix of sentences that were totally like quotidian, like I go to the park, like something that anyone could say. And then, clashing against that, things that were utterances that were a little bit more like idiosyncratic, strange, especially later on in the book where you get to more, convoluted sentences due to the tenses, kind of playing against that. Yeah.
Okay, so how do you categorize this book? Do you categorize it? Because it is one of those works that resists easy classification. Is it poetry? Is it autobiography? What is it?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I've always been interested in moving in between forms and kind of assimilating a lot of different qualities of different genres. What I found interesting is I did an interview for Hobart, and Nick, the person who interviewed it, said he called it a novel, and he called the person speaking the narrator of the novel, which I found very funny because I never considered it a novel, but I also don't really know. I mean, it could be poetry. I think there are similarities to things like I Remember by Joe Brainerd, which is kind of a book of poetry, also kind of not. I'm not sure. I feel like it exists, somewhere in between those places, and that's, I like that. I like that it has that ambiguity.
I've been thinking lately about a category of book that is just called book. Like, we don't have to call it a novel. We don't have to call it poet. Like, it's just a book. I don't know. Call it whatever you want to call it. Like, does that impulse resonate with you?
Yeah, that reminds me. I was once teaching a creative writing class, and I showed my students one of Dennis Cooper's GIF novels. I don't know if you've ever seen them, where it's just a collection of GIFs. Like, you just scroll through all these GIFs, and he calls them a novel. And, so I showed them to the class, and I think it was like a class of freshmen. And one student, I was like, so what do you think? Like, is this a novel? Can we think of this as a novel? And one student said, like, who cares? It's just cool. Like, that's all that matters to me, which I thought was really funny.
I've had arguments with people, or not arguments, but I've decided unilaterally that if Andy Warhol were alive today, the GIF would be his preferred medium.
I could definitely see that. Absolutely.
They feel, you know what I'm saying? I think GIFs are really, really interesting and amusing. I think I don't know. I think there's something to that. And I know Dennis Cooper's work. I've had him on the show before. I have not seen the GIF novel, but I feel like that's exactly the kind of thing he would be doing. And somebody's got to be working in this space. It's kind of on the outer reaches. I guess it would be called avant-garde. That seems like the space you live in. Is that how you conceive of yourself in your own work? Are you really, do you define yourself as an experimental writer? Is that your area of interest, to try to find new forms or to work in hybrid forms?
Yeah, I mean, maybe by accident, but I do think that it's hard for me to sort of sit down and just say like, all right, I'm going to write a story about some, I don't know, some difficult emotional period of my life or whatever. I just get so bored of it so quickly. That never really animates the writing. For me, it's a lot of like formal play and thinking about tradition in the writers that I like. That's always the stuff that I am the most excited by. And I think, in general, I'm sure this is true for a lot of people, but I feel like, I only started writing because I liked reading so much. Like I felt like writing was a continuation of my reading. And so because the things I read tend to be in that world, the things I write follow suit,
So you don't, like, when you talk about writing about, from a place of personal anguish or some difficult period, what bores you about it?
I don't know. It's because I feel like inevitably that type of stuff does come up, like it doesn't matter how, or at the very least, like the experimental work, if we want to call it that I love, isn't like a totally conceptual exercise. It's not just to do something strange. There always has to be something a bit more, I don't know, a bit more human in it. And so that material, those emotions, I feel like those things always crop up regardless of the form you're working in. But I think that in terms of straightforward kinds of, if we want to say like confessional writing, a part of me feels like, there's so many books in the world, and a kind of guilt that I've always felt as a writer is like, should I put another thing in the world, regardless of if anybody reads it or not? Like, it feels like there's this gigantic heap, this like garbage pile of human art in existence, and to do something that's like, I don't know, so repeatable feels excessive. Like I feel like.
But wouldn't it be if it was your specific experience, your personal experience? How is that repeatable?
You're totally right. I think like this is definitely like a personal hang up, because even with super experimental work, it's always coming from a certain tradition of writers and artists who've already done stuff like that. And so I guess I think of it as it's like you want to enter a house through a particular entry point, like to me, like walking into, it's like maybe like a pretentious metaphor, but like walking into the house of literature or art or whatever, through the perspective of writing, the way that I was talking about before, like traditional confessional stuff seems like it's just not as interesting. Like, I want to enter that world from a different perspective, but it's I guess it's a satisfying explanation to myself, but maybe not to other people.
Do you feel like the experimental stuff is emotionally easier? Like to go in straightforward is just too emotionally uncomfortable, or is that not a factor?
I think that's a really that's a really good way to put it. I've never really thought about it like that before. I think also too, it's like I don't know. I guess I was sort of talking about it before, but like I don't know if a nerve or an emotion is the primary thing that drives my wanting to write something. It's always a kind of echo off something else. Usually something that I've read, something that I admire, and wanting to sort of like reshape it or play with it in my own way. And I feel like in the past when I've taught creative writing, I've told students like, the best way to get better, just copy somebody you like. Just copy a writer you like, and it's not going to be as good, but you keep doing that over and over again to different writers, and then eventually you're going to find yourself doing something that's exciting to you. So yeah, I guess in terms of the question of emotion, it's like it's just that's never the place where I start personally.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that we learn through mimicry, or copying, like you're saying, like it's kind of one of these things that can be easy to overlook. But I think to the composition of the book that I just finished, and for some reason I was just reading Philip Roth because I felt like I had this gap in my in my reading. I have so many gaps, but I get guilty.
Me too.
I feel guilty because I'm like, oh my God, I've never read Philip Roth. And then I went through this phase where that was like kind of all I was reading, and it helped me. I think it just helped me at the level of, okay, so this is somebody who's considered really skilled at narrative, at like putting a narrative together, and strong mind, strong voice on the page. I don't know what it was. It was kind of unexpected, but I don't want to say that I tried to write a Philip Roth novel, but I do feel like sometimes even focusing on one or a small set of writers or influences can help you, or it can help me, like, voice my own projects. Does that make sense?
Totally. Yeah, I mean, I think, so I've just been working on a novel starting, I hope to dedicate the majority of next year to actually writing it and finishing it. But one of the things that I've been doing is, like, I have a stack of books that are books that I kind of partially want, like spiritually want to influence it. And so what I've been doing is just like picking one of those books, reading a page at random before I write, not necessarily copying anything from those books, but just kind of getting an energy, a tone, a spirit, something like that from it, and hoping that some of that stuff will work its way into what I'm working on. So what I've only read Goodbye Columbus. What was your favorite Philip Roth thing?
I'm trying to think. I read American Pastoral. That was really strong. I think that The Human Stain is really strong, and I think that maybe Sabbath's Theater.
Yeah, I heard that one's like the really like wild one, right?
Yeah, that's what I was just gonna say. I mean, that's a really crazy book, and I found it it was one of those books that I think after I finished it, my opinion of it improved with time, the more that I thought about it. But those are probably the three that I found most impressive. And I think, too, there was something inspiring and interesting to me about the fact that he wrote all of these books after having this like major heart surgery. And like,
oh, wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he had like a big health scare, kind of near death. It was definitely one of those sort of perspective-giving health experiences. And then he had this enormously creative writing period in his like late middle age and into his like senior years, which is unusual. So I think there's a part of me that's like, how do I stay sharp like that when I'm in my 60s?
Right.
Like, I don't want to be one of these people who gets like old and tired and repetitive, or So I don't know. I'm always looking to people who, like, David Lynch is sort of that way too.
Totally.
There are a lot of examples you could point to, but it's like, how do you continue to be creatively generative and open well into your older age?
I remember reading an interview with Philip Roth a few years ago where they asked him, like, what are you reading nowadays? And he said, I don't read fiction anymore. It's a total waste of time. Like, I just read history. Like, I regret having spent so many years reading novels. It's like I forgot all of them. I should have just learned about the world that I actually lived in, which I found a part of me didn't know how like tongue-in-cheek that was, because obviously this guy's dedicated his life to writing fiction. But I found it interesting in terms of, yeah, like if you do dedicate your life to a medium, is there ever a time when you just kind of say like, all right, I'm done? I don't know.
All right, folks, there we have it. Today's flashback, episode 679, my conversation with Sebastian Castillo. The episode first aired on November 4th, 2020. And a reminder once again that if you like what you just heard and you want to listen to the full conversation with Sebastian Castillo, it's available wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for episode 679. You can find Sebastian Castillo on social media. He's on Twitter and I believe on Instagram. Definitely on Twitter. Don't forget to subscribe to The Other People Show wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also subscribe on YouTube. Follow the show on social media, TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, and Blue Sky. Sign up for my weekly email newsletter over at bradlisti.substack.com. It is free. And join the Other People Patreon community over at patreon.com/otherpplpod. Help keep this show going into the future. If you want to join my book club, you can do that at the show's official website, otherppl.com. Get a new book delivered to your door every 30 days for just $9.99 a month. That's less than the cost of a book. I interview book club authors on this podcast. If you want to get an Other People t-shirt, you can do that at otherppl.com. And if you have a couple of minutes and you want to do me a quick favor, please give this show a rating wherever you listen, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever it is. Rate the show, review the show. It helps the show find new listeners. Last but not least, a quick plug for my latest novel. It is called Be Brief and Tell Them Everything, available now in trade paperback, ebook, and audiobook editions. I narrate the audiobook, so it's my book. You can read it, or I will read it to you. It's called Be Brief and Tell Them Everything. All right, so coming up on Sunday, my guest will be Tana French. She has a new novel out called The Hunter. It is the official pick of the Other People Book Club for the month of March. Tana French, the queen of Irish crime fiction. We had an excellent conversation. You don't want to miss this. Stay tuned.